Evening. Welcome to the broadcast. Today is Tuesday, August 25th, 2020, and this is Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. If it sounds a little bit different, if it looks a little bit different, I am broadcasting from just outside of New York City, sitting in a quarantine Airbnb for a couple of weeks before I drop my son off for college, for his first year of college. So that's why things might look and sound a little bit different than they usually do. This was one of the most popular for many years broadcasts that I ever did. I think it's something that probably speaks to the anxiety that parents have the most. I think when I went through it myself as a parent, it offered me a unique perspective on the challenges that families go through when they're selecting, and just gave me that advantage of sitting in your seat, walking in your shoes. So I'll bring that wisdom and experience. And most importantly tonight, I'm not going to tell you, I'm just going to give you a list of ideas, of concepts, of tools, where then you can make your own decision. And I hope, as I always do, that the principles will be applicable to all of you, regardless of what stage you're in. So while we're going to be talking about how to choose the next step after a vote for your child, I think there are principles in tonight's broadcast that speak to every decision that we make with our children, and maybe even every decision we make with our life. It's about, like I talk about it and teach about it all the time, the work, the idea in our work at Evoke with families, with parents, with children. We believe that it's a transformational process. And that word transformation really speaks to the fundamental shift that we go through when we do this work. It's not about a set of tools or skills, although those can help. It's not about a slightly different perspective. It's really about a different way of thinking and being in a process. And so it's with that, I suppose, grand idea that we'll walk into tonight's broadcast about how to choose the best fit aftercare, how to choose the next step for your child after Evoke. Let's talk a little bit about what Evoke does do, and then that will lead to the next decision. Evoke oftentimes interrupts a crisis. I love it because it's a short-term decision, relatively speaking, for a big, sometimes long-term problem or issue. And so we don't want to make long-term decisions in a crisis, right? We want to be able to pause, to slow it down, to catch our breath, to stabilize the crisis. And so Evoke interrupts that crisis and gives you time to breathe. And this really is a traumatic time for everybody involved. It's traumatic for the child leading up to Evoke itself, and it's traumatic for the family, right? Everybody's experiencing a high level of stress. It gives you a kind of an attention and a focus for you and your work, but also for the child. A lot of families will ask me, why is there so much family therapy? If this is all going to be about as much family therapy as you suggested is at Evoke, why are we apart? And I think that's a fair question. And my answer, of course, is because it's in this quiet, separate space that you're in that you're able to do the most work. My therapist offered the adage some years ago when she said it was something about a child issue in my family, or maybe a marital issue. And she said to me, it's best to strike while the iron is cold, which of course goes against the old saying, strike while the iron is hot. You don't want to bring up difficult, complex thoughts, ideas, processes in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a difficult person. He's in the night. I'm not sick. It's a time to you want to make those kinds of adjustments, have those difficult discussions. You want to have them when you're not under a lot of stress. So the focus is intensified. The focus for the child, you have their attention, right? You have their focus. And you can slow down the process. The communication slows down, right? The back and forth is slowed down to an email a week or two a week of a process. And when you slow things down that much, you can have a lot more success. It's an assessment program. You know, I always talk about there's, 1/3 of our program is assessment. 1/3 of it is kind of seeing what works for the child. Do they have a diagnosis that lends itself to a certain kind of treatment? Do they have a learning disability? What are the ways cognitively that might be underlying the emotional or the substance use issues? And so all of that becomes a part of the assessment. Not just can there be a formal assessment, which you can have a formal assessment done while your child is here if you choose to, where you have a psychologist come in and do some testing. But you also have the kind of assessment that comes from a natural observation, right? We see them, so to speak, in their natural habitat, that is with other peers under situations. I don't know if some of you caught this article. I've shared it a couple of times over the last couple of years, but Harvard has realized that programs like Evoke are best for team building. That primitive living, camping outside with groups is the best way to build trust and camaraderie and facilitate and develop healthy communication patterns. NASA uses primitive living wilderness therapy for its teams if they haven't worked together to build trust. And what they both know and have learned is that contrived exercises and conversations don't work as well as the kinds of conversations and problem solving and communication that has to happen in a wilderness group. So you get all of that diagnostics, and then from all of that you make a prognosis. This is what we see works for him or her or them. This is what doesn't work for them. And so you start to talk about. I say to the staff all the time, if by the end of the week you tell me 5 things that didn't work. At the end of the week, 5 things that didn't work, and that's as helpful as anything. We're starting to rule out things that he or she or they don't respond to. That could be as helpful. Obviously, part of it is a therapeutic intervention. I think parents probably think that's 100% of it, but that's 1/3 of it. It's an interruption, a stabilization, it's an assessment, and it's also a therapeutic intervention. We can make quite remarkable progress in a relatively short period of time. Now, whether or not that change is maintained and sustained will be somewhat dependent on the aftercare plan, the recommendations that we make, the follow through on your part, the work that you do, right? Sometimes people say to me, the kids will say often in the field, well, if I'm going to go on to another therapeutic school or program after this, why not just go now? So here are some of the answers to those questions. It's because wilderness therapy changes the level of care that you need. You can make a certain amount of progress here that qualifies you for a different program. A lot of programs will tell you that wilderness kind of takes off the sharp edges of their demonstrative behavior. Fighting that initial fight, because this is a big betrayal of the old agreement oftentimes in families. And I use the word betrayal very intentionally as a therapeutic idea. It is a shift from the way things used to be and kind of the old agreements, if you will, to a new agreement, a new way of being with each other. So you change levels of care. You start to then develop ideas about what works, like I said, but you also prioritize. If I gave you a list of 5 things, 6 things, 10 things that your child responded to, you're not going to find a setting that has all 5, 6, or 10 things. So you prioritize. What's the most important thing for your child? What's the most important element in the next setting that's important for your child? So you're determining what the various elements and also the priorities. And then you're preparing people for that next step. Like I said, you're getting them ready for that next step. It doesn't always happen, but I would say in about 1/3 of the cases that I work with, this is just my own anecdotal report to you all, about 1/3 of the cases that I would work with, the child would get to the point where he or she would say, I don't want to go on to another school program, but I can see the benefit. I could see myself relapsing. But this is important. They almost never arrive at that idea, that sentiment, without the door being closed to coming home. I'm going to say that again. They almost never arrive at the point where they say, I know it's probably the best thing for me. They almost never arrive at that idea until the door is completely closed on coming home. If there remains a crack or a hope, kind of digesting the idea, making sense out of it, moving through, maybe you might think of them as the stages of grief, ultimately towards acceptance, is a very rare achievement, unless that's happened for them. Okay, so that's a part of the process for sure. I got to check something real quick, make sure that I have all the cords plugged in. A little bit of a peek behind the curtain tonight on my quarantine. So while I do this, I'll try to talk at the same time. I get the question very, very often. What is your rates of success? And we have Evoke has done. I don't think it's even arguable. Evoke has done the most research of any wilderness program in the United States. Matt Hoig, my partner, Dr. Matt Hoig, in fact, he helped develop the instrument in graduate school, when he was in graduate school, that all programs in our field use to measure progress. The OQ, the YOQ. It's a measure that we use to measure progress in therapy. So the research is there. You can go to our website, you can look at it there. But what I will tell you, and I believe this is not a spin, this is the truth, it's the truest thing that I know, which is I guarantee you success if you do your work. If you do your work and remain committed to your work, the world will change. The world will change first because your eyes and ears change. Secondly, the world will change in response to you. It just shifts in response to you. We know that. We know it, that the shifts that we make internally, there are a lot of stories in this world of people going through various traumas. We're all going through a shared trauma right now with this pandemic and all of the related aspects of the pandemic. And everybody has their own story, everybody's unique story of trauma and challenge. But we know as therapists that you can, even in the most difficult of circumstances, you can have hope. You can have 2 books that's part of our required reading for our curriculum at Evoke is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And if you don't know the book, it's sold several million copies. I recommend it to you. Viktor Frankl was a prisoner in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. And essentially he developed an idea, a model of therapy it's part of an existential group of therapies that basically says, when you can't change your circumstances, you're left to change yourself. That's on the front of my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, that quote. It says, at the end of the day, the one thing that couldn't be taken away from him was how he dealt with it. And what I love about Viktor Frankl's book, not only is it well written and well thought out, have great ideas in it, is he wins. All of his family were killed, and to be a prisoner in a concentration camp nobody can really say to you, well, you didn't have it as bad as I did, right? I had it worse than you did. Take somebody writing a book from that perspective to say happiness is still peace, right? A fundamental foundational level of peace is still an inside job. We've got to believe that. We've got to believe. It's imperative for you all to believe that happiness is not reliant, dependent on your child's well-being. I know that sounds crazy. And I'm a father and not a mother, and I get accused of that all the time, and it's true. I'm not a mother. It's imperative for our children and their well-being that we accept the idea that our fundamental peace is our responsibility. If you walk into Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous, you will hear the slogan, your serenity is your responsibility. Let's sidetrack by some of the ideas. Back to the slides. Let's talk a little bit about the role of an education consultant. Some of you have them. We strongly encourage them. I always use myself as an example. When my son was struggling, my oldest son, who's now 27, when he was struggling as a teenager, I hired an education consultant. No discount, no professional courtesy rate. I hired them at full price. And I had been at that time, I had been a wilderness therapist for 10 years. 10 years. So I knew the field well enough to probably negotiate it on my own. But I wanted that advocate. I wanted that independent voice. I didn't even, when she eventually recommended our program, which I did not at all see coming on the horizon, and after she recommended it, it made all the sense in the world. I wanted somebody on the journey with me doing that. So I believe in them that strongly that I hired one for myself. I used another one later on for college placement for one of my children too. So I believe in their role and what they add to this equation. Of course, as mental health professionals, we can give you names of programs without a consultant. It is our ethical responsibility to do that, and we will. They make it their job to know programs, to match you up with people, to visit, to have their finger on the pulse of things, and to walk beside you along the way. So we become the kind of, we become this partner with them to give them the information about the child and the family and the needs. They translate that information into their field of expertise of walking you through the next steps after Evoke and whatever comes after that. That's the ideal. So we give them criteria-based reports. We tell them what's going on, what's working. I think it's really important when you're doing your weekly phone calls with your therapist at any program, anywhere, at any part of this process, that not only do they give you the information, but they tell you what it means. When my son was at Evoke 14 years ago, when he was at Evoke, I was sure to ask them. I said, I know what happens in the field. I do this every week, but I want to know what it means, what you think it means. I needed their help to understand. So the therapist takes the information from the child, young adult or adolescent child, from the parent, from the family, from the dynamics that are there, and they give all that information over to the therapist. If you have an education consultant, we're going to defer to them with program names. We're not gonna add program names to them. Like I said, it's our obligation, and we will offer them to you if you don't have a consultant, but they're kind of a full service professional in that area. I want to get a school from a professional who knows their child. They'll say that to me, like they'll say, Brad, I want to know from, you're working with my son, my daughter. I want a recommendation that comes from you. And what I always say to them is, you are getting a recommendation from me when your consultant gives it. That's where it came from. It came from the marriage between the two of us. Oftentimes we're collaborating with them offline. Some consultants join all or some of the calls online. You mean they come on the phone calls, your weekly phone calls? It's up to you, and it's up to the consultant's preference how that happens. But consultation and information happens both online and offline. Sometimes you're on the phone, sometimes you're not. They'll often start off with a range of schools and programs, and that list becomes more and more narrow as you go along. School ends up on your list, be a good fit and a quality program, right? That's their job, is to give something that fits and something that's quality. And that's why in those cases, you're not going to get, that's going to be your recommendation. The therapist isn't going to participate in those cases. And how your therapist at a vote feels about the list, if it's on the list, it came from your therapist. It came from the collaboration between them. Let's talk about the various kinds of schools and programs. See, there are lots of great programs out there. The problem by just doing word of mouth, I've worked with 25 fantastic aftercare programs in my career, right? But not all of them would be a good fit for each of your children. So while I could tell you that one worked for my son was wonderful, it might not be a good fit. And even within that program, it might not be a good fit for the therapist, for the family, or for the child. Let's talk about different kinds of models. So sometimes there's a two-stage model. A one-stage model means evoke, next placement, home. Model might mean evoke, next placement, step down. Kind of a gradual kind of progression down toward eventually no external support. So you can have more than one stage. Length of stays are going to vary anywhere from the shorter length of stays are going to be off, maybe the 8-9 month might be the shortest length of stay. I always told families on the outset, you should probably expect that most of these models are going to be around a year. Typical average length of stay. How insulated you are. This is a pro and a con, and it's not a simple idea. The more structured and therapeutic it is, the more you're insulated from your child. The more integrated the program is into the communities. For young adults, for example, it's common for them to have interactions with college or a trade program or working, right? They're going to be in the community sometimes. Some adolescent programs can work their way toward that level of integration in the community. But this is important. It's not just about privileges. And I think families, parents, and children oftentimes think of it as privileges, measured by its privileges. I will tell you this, to be clear. The more privileges, the more difficult it is. The more privileges, the more advanced the child has to be. The more privileges, the less insulation, which you might think is a good thing. But are you both ready for that? Are you ready to get those phone calls from a step-down program with your child complaining every day that they want to come home and that they don't need this anymore? Are you ready for that? Are you ready to have one where the temptations that are afforded them with the extra privileges are going to be present? Computer gaming, substance. They have access. If they have a lot of access to the community, they're going to have access to substances. Again, I'm not painting that as positive or negative. It's a fit issue. I think one issue that I always think about is tolerance. I always want, the longer I did it, the longer I've done it, the more I want it to be the right fit for your child on one of their worst days. A high ceiling for a program, right? That's an idea that we have. But I talk about like the floor. Where's the floor? I don't want to set you and your child up for that on their bad day, when they're struggling, when they're regressing, that it's going to be a bad fit for them and they might get kicked out. So you have to measure both the ceiling and the floor when you're considering the tolerance, what a program can tolerate. Personality, how much of a mental health issue. Can they tolerate, do they tolerate, for example, regression and relapse? Or is it an automatic you're dismissed from the program. All of those come into our thinking when we're talking about it. I talked about buffer, like I think some parents they think this is really tough. They feel guilty. They want their child to have what they want. They want their child to have a reward. They want their child to have the privileges that he or she or they are asking for. And so they kind of feel pulled in that direction. But again, sometimes those programs offer less of a buffer. Wilderness has a lot of buffers, right? For the first 4 or 5 weeks, you're only talking to your child through letters. Eventually you get on phone calls. During times of non-pandemic, there's field visits. During times of pandemic, we try to do some video calls with the child, but you're buffered. You know, the check-in is once a week. You're not riding the roller coaster with them on a daily basis. And that can be exhausting and stressful when a child is struggling and low functioning. To ride the roller coaster with them is part of the difficulty, part of the pain. Doesn't need to be. You know, what's the diagnosis? And how clinical does the staff need to be? Oftentimes, more clinical means more support. Some years ago, my partner was playing around with the idea about having our own aftercare, extended, if you will, care setting in the wilderness. And at one point when we were considering this, we never went ahead with it, but we were considering this, he was suggesting that you know, maybe that there's more therapy. And I said, there should be less therapy. Right? If we're talking about extended care, we should have very little therapy. Therapy is support. Therapy prioritizes mental health over taking out the garbage, cleaning your room, doing your schoolwork, right? At Evoke, everything besides physical safety, everything is prioritized behind therapy. As long as you're physically safe, therapy takes precedence. That doesn't happen at a school or a college or at work. At work, if you're working at a fast food restaurant, have a standing group. Teachers in a school don't want to stop and process heavy emotions during a math lesson. So the amount of clinical support there is, you know, is more support. That's why I say, and I point this out when I say this all the time, that in some ways, Evoke is the easiest thing your child's ever going to do, because there'll never be a place where they have this much support, this much of a backstop, of a safety net. How much of an academic focus is the academic focus meet their learning difference if they have one? Is the academic focus too high so that it causes stress and anxiety? Do they need something that's really academically challenging because that's part of what drives them? Academic focus is part of it. How much parental involvement? And this goes for young adults, because there are different levels of parental involvement. And all that is asking is, what's the best thing for the child? And it's not as simple. And more or less, the same thing. You know, are we talking about addiction? Some children that suffer from substance use disorder, they look really good really fast in our program. Because once you remove the substance abuse from their life, for the most part, they're fairly high functioning. That's a very different profile than somebody who struggles with significant depression or anxiety or other mental health issues. So you're looking at where that fits. And also, substance use disorder, substance abuse is, you know, for those that struggle with addiction, with compulsive behaviors around substance use, it takes away everything, right? Relapse is an enormous risk for their stability. Co-ed, you know, it's complicated with transgender, with homosexuality, with bisexuality. It's complicated. For the most part, in a vacuum, most programs are single gender. We want more programs to be supportive of our trans and our non-binary students, because we have more and more of those, and there's a real limited amount of programs that are supportive of those identities. But all else being equal, we prefer single gender. It keeps things simple. You know, in psychology, developmentally speaking, when we're thinking about the developmental tasks that build upon themselves for human beings, finding out who you are should come before partnering up. We Americans do it backwards. We Americans skip finding out about ourselves often and launch ourselves into relationships straight from our family of origin to our significant other. And we skip that time for self-discovery in the middle because it's difficult and messy and there aren't a lot of models for it. And we often end up in relationships that are more indicative of our woundedness than of our strong and secure sense of ourselves. So single gender tends to suggest that developmental psychology idea more. Some of them are small. Most of them, you know, back when I did this years ago, there was a lot of institutionalized programs. There's a lot, you know, even the ones that are still institutional nowadays, they still have a family style feel to them. They don't feel institutional. They're oftentimes in homes, right? Beds, you know, the amount of students or clients in one setting would be between 8 and 20. Some are more, of course, but family style is one step, one version, one model. Transitional or step down programs, again, those are programs where, especially for young adults, where you're out in the community more, right? You work your way in rather quickly to having freedoms. And with those freedoms come temptations and challenges. Residential treatment centers, oftentimes referred to as RTCs, are going to be more clinical. You're starting to talk about prioritizing clinical work over education, if you had to. Therapeutic boarding schools, you know, it's going to have a significant clinical component, but you're starting to talk more about emphasizing the academics. And there are schools, you know, it doesn't really play right now during the pandemic, but there are schools outside of the United States that are fantastic because there's a cultural immersion. And as you know, people learn so much by getting out of your context. Costa Rica, Samoa, some in Africa, and even Europe. There are some programs. Ask your consultant about that. There are a few. Some of them, unfortunately, right now are not accepting clients from the United States, so that's a challenge. You know, we call our end of program experience transition. We don't call it graduation, where I worked before we started Evoke 22 years ago now. The place I worked before then, we called it graduation. We decided to call it transition because we wanted to emphasize that the work is never done. I don't mean for this to be overwhelmingly discouraging, but the work is never done. This work, our work, my work, your work, their work, it's a lifetime's work. It takes a long time to unlearn what we learned and to be different. And it can't be simply academically understood and integrated immediately. You know, it takes a long time to make a shift. Sometimes programs have a 12-step emphasis, so we will assess for that if that's a necessary or recommended component, in our opinion, for the child. Some are more experiential. Evoke, obviously, is a wilderness, primitive living wilderness program, is very experiential. Some have more experiential components, adventure activities, international travel. Some have themes that, you know, some work on triathlons, some emphasize music and art. So those kinds of experiences can be a part of it. Sober living environments, or SLEs as they're referred to sometimes, are for people leaving primary care that need support but are looking to integrate back into society quicker rather than later. These are the kind of criteria that we talk about. We talk about high family involvement versus individual treatment. All of that has to do with the age, the diagnosis, and if the family is able, willing, and would benefit from it. It's not always the same. Is there a high level of physical activity versus a low level? Are they going to be more of an academic? Or do they benefit more from activities, outdoor sports, and so forth? Is it going to be systems-based or relational-based? And what I mean by that is college, for example, is more systemically based, right? You go to college, you fit into a system. Relationally based, for example, the school that my son is going to, that we're dropping him off in a couple of weeks, is a very, very small liberal arts school. We only looked, for the most part, at small liberal arts school because that's what we thought was a good fit for him. That's going to be more relationship based. You know, he has a mentor, a professor that serves as a mentor that he's already been introduced to, and then we'll follow him for the first couple of years, and that they'll meet every other week, and that person becomes their kind of their support, their guide, their mentor. Home visits. Don't assume that more home visits is always good. You know, for some of these students and clients, I'm going to tell you this story about my oldest son. In fact, I'll tell you about my son who's going to college for the first time in 2 weeks too, because I can tell the same kind of story for him. When my son was moving away when he was 19, I remember being heartbroken. It was my firstborn son. He was moving away. This is long after treatment, and at this point, he'd been sober for a couple of years. And he was moving away, and I was heartbroken, sad. It was grief, a tremendous amount of grief. And in a therapy session, while I was talking about the grief, my therapist said, you know, he knows how much you love him. And that gave me a great deal of peace because I thought nothing I can do in these last few days leading up to his leaving will change his experience of how much and how I love him. But then she said something in the way that she says things. She says, and he needs to get as far away from you as he can. And immediately the pain was gone. Immediately I knew she was right. He needed to get away from me. And I could do that for him. My son, who's going to college here in New York in a couple of weeks, we were thinking about moving out here. And actually, I would like to teach at the school that he's going to. Of all the schools that there are, that would be one of the ones that I would like to teach. I love it as much as he does. And as a family, we talked about it. And we said, maybe not for the entire 4 years, but at least for the first couple of years, we're not gonna be anywhere close to you. Like, you need to get away. In fact, when we were debating, it's the pandemic right now, and when we were debating whether or not it was safe or the right thing to do, because of course they're offering a stay-at-home option and an online school as one of the options, we all decided, and he decided that he was going to come to school here. And we said to him at one point, we said, look, if it gets bad, you're just going to be sitting in your dorm by yourself, which is not that much different than if you're in your own room kind of doing your classes on Zoom. We said, would you rather be at home, you know, with all the comforts of home and be in your room on Zoom, or rather be in a college dorm? And he smiled and instantly said, I'd rather be in a college dorm. And as I started to ask the question why, I knew the answer. I said, it's to get away from us, isn't it? And he smiled and he said, yep, it's to get away from you guys. These are healthy things that we can do for them. And for your children, I know it's happening a little bit earlier. The two stories that I just told were at 18 and 19. I know that. But for these children, it sometimes happens a couple of years earlier. And I'll tell you this, because I've been through both twice. It's not any easier. When they go away for the good things, if you will, it wasn't easier than when they went away for the hard things, the treatment things. At least for me. Both were equally, exquisitely painful to me as a father. But what gave me the strength to do it is knowing that they needed to get away from me. So home visits is not clear cut. Nobody loves my children more than me and my wife, period. Nobody can even compete. Nobody loves your child more than you, period. But that's separate from this idea of differentiation, of individuating, of distance that needs to happen. Is it a group therapy process or individual therapy? Those are part of the question. Far from home, close to home. Obviously, those can like wilderness therapy, can kind of mimic this kind of differentiation journey that I'm talking about. What's the social savvy quotient? The social savviness quotient of your child? Quotient of your child? Is it, is it are they on the spectrum? Is that part of it? What's the first priority, as I mentioned? We come up with a list of criteria, but then we prioritize. Sometimes consultants will put schools on the list that don't seem very similar, but part of what they're doing is they're getting you to make a decision and to choose the pros and cons that you want. You can't ultimately delegate this job to somebody else. Even after the consultant and the therapist do their work, and even if they're great at what they do, it still is your choice, because it's going to be hard no matter what. It's going to be hard no matter what, even in the best of circumstances. So it's your decision to make, and the consequences are too big to abdicate the responsibility to somebody else. How do you make the decision? You ask tough questions. Talk to the therapist of the new program. Talk to your educational consultant. Talk to as many parents as you can. You don't take everything they say at face value, but you listen to themes. Ask lots of questions. Talk to the admissions folks. Take a tour if you can. Talk to students. Again, they're only going to give you the students that are doing well there. They're not going to give you the students that are hating it. But when I visit schools, I want to hear what they're saying, because I run it through my adult filter and I listen to the themes beneath the words. Why won't professionals give me their best choice? Why won't they just tell me the one school I should choose? Because they want it to be your choice. They'll usually give you 2 or 3 choices that they think are an adequate fit and have you choose between them, because they want it to be your choice. Whether or not your child gets to have a say in it depends on a couple of things. If they're a young adult, oftentimes they'll have more of a say in it, right? You'll give them a couple of choices after you've vetted them. And then from those couple of choices, they'll choose which one they like the best. That's a typical young adult strategy. For adolescents, they can have a similar type of say if they've done a lot of work, if they're accepting enough, if they're not demanding and making a list of things that you have to give them. When the adolescent child says, at the end of the day, the most important factor in me being successful at my next placement will be me. And yes, there are things that I would prefer and like, but my best thinking got me here. When they start to sound like that, when they start to sound like what I would describe in psychology as surrender, kind of a humility, then I'm more interested in what they have to say. When they start giving me a list of 5 things they have to have, or else it's not going to be successful, I'm less interested in what they have to say. I'm still listening, so you can always ask them what they want. But if they're adolescent, you don't have to take them at face value. And if they're a young adult, you still get to put parameters. You still get to put the options on the list that you're willing to support, or they can go it on their own. Money is a thing, and be honest with yourself. This is an expensive operation. This is an expensive journey. And I have both been paid by it and I have paid into it. And it's not inexpensive. And those are real. And they are what they are. Sometimes people would come up with a few choices, people want more and more. And again, some people will give you more and more and more choices until you get one that you like, that you think works. But sometimes they'll say, these are the ones that I recommend. You can, if these aren't the ones that if you can't choose from this list of options that I've given you, you're welcome to go on the internet or to talk to other parents. In the end, it's your choice, it's your gut. For the transition, folks, make it as seamless as possible. I can say this because I'm not any one of your therapists that are listening or watching tonight. Shorter the better. The more seamless, the better. Use the time during non-COVID, use the time in the field for the time together. We also have a pursuits program that a couple of people have started to utilize where they check out of Evoke Wilderness Therapy Program. We have a program that we started years ago that's a pursuits option where you can do adventure activities with staff, with Evoke staff, and do whitewater rafting, mountain biking, camping, fishing, other things. So you can do a pursuits in between if your therapist thinks it's clinically appropriate and still spend some time together. And then this is the most, I'm going to say this clearly and emphatically, it's the most fragile time. The most fragile time for your child is the time in between when you sign the paperwork at Evoke and the time that you sign the paperwork on your way into the next program. That's the most vulnerable time. And more privileges and more phone calls and more freedoms they might seem like that it will somehow satiate your child. I will tell you, it also creates an emotional challenge that makes it hard to let go. Keep the transition between Evoke and the next step as seamless and simple as possible. Typically speaking, we don't ask for anybody but the parents, the co-parents, to do it. And go from point A to point B, be as efficiently as you can, unless, of course, that other option that I mentioned is a good fit for your family. Like I said earlier on this broadcast, getting buy-in from your child almost always comes after you close the door for them coming home. I usually suggest to parents that they tell their children right away at Evoke that they're working with, the parent tells the child, we're working with your therapist at Evoke and with a consultant at home to decide the next step. I would want the child to expect that on the front end. Believe me, they can adjust easily to the surprising news that they're coming home if that decision gets made. I've never had a child, well, that's not true. I did have a couple. Really struggled with that. Felt let down by the parents that they actually got brought home. But for the most part, that's an easy transition to make. You want to take the finish line away because you don't want them to be focused on arriving. You want to be focused on the journey, not the destination. Whatever you do, do not sell the next step to your child. Don't try to convince them that it's the right decision. Do not sell it to them. For every positive thing you think about it, tell them something about the program you think they're not going to like. It's the simple psychology that follows. All of you have experienced this, or most of you have. Have you ever looked forward to a movie or had somebody tell you that a movie or a TV show is going to be amazing, or a restaurant, or a pie? It's going to be amazing. It's hard to live up to that. So don't oversell it. Don't try to convince your child on the front end of how wonderful it's going to be and how many wonderful professionals have helped you along the way and how you've made the best possible decision. You just say, here's our choice. This is what we think is going to work. And then back off. Detach from it. I use an analogy that I've found to be true over the years. It's like juggling. At Evoke, you learn to juggle 3 balls, right? It's a very contained, safe, and in a lot of ways, like I said earlier, the easiest thing you and your child are ever going to do in some ways. And you learn to juggle 3 balls. When you leave Evoke, you'll be handed 2 or 3 more balls. And you'll drop all of them. Because to go from 3, which I can do, I can juggle 3 balls. To go from 3 to 5 is a different world. And if I try to juggle 5 balls, even 4 balls right now, I would drop all of them. I haven't forgotten how to juggle. I just have more to juggle. And it's difficult. So that's the process. They're going to have more to juggle. It's going to be harder. Each step away from Evoke gets harder. And you should expect the standard complaint from your child at the next step, which is, this is not the right place. I could come home. Evoke was great, even if they said it wasn't while they were here. Evoke was great, I miss it, but this place stinks and these aren't the right people. That usually comes. When should they move on? That's a discussion, a dialogue, a model that you create together with your Evoke therapist. We have a bias towards aftercare Evoke that comes from our experience. My theoretical background tells me, suggests to me that they should come home after Evoke. That's what my theoretical model tells me. My experience has shown me that that doesn't work for a lot of the families, the great majority of the families that come to Evoke. That's not an indictment on you. It's just the place that you're at and the place that your child is at. They still need continued support. They need something that's, the next step is a little bit less dynamic than Evoke. The progress is going to be a little bit less dynamic, dramatic. It's going to be more like real life, kind of boring for you and for them. But that's kind of like life. Tell your Evoke therapist what you need in terms of recommendation, support, and feedback. Like advocate, ask tough questions. Be honest about your concerns and reservations. If it's about money, tell them it's about money. If it's not about money, don't use that as the red herring. If it's that you miss them, if it's that you think that they would do better if they came home, talk about that so we can process it. And what I say to my therapists, I train them all the time, do not talk about the what of the recommendation. Talk about the why. Talk about the psychology that goes into it. When the father said to me years ago on one case, I'm bringing my son home because last time, he was a young adult, last time when he went away to college and he failed, this time I'm bringing him home so I can make sure that he succeeds. I said, that thinking is a problem. Understand? That thinking that you can control it, that it's up to you, that's a problem. We need to address that. Whether or not you take him home or not is yours. They ended up not taking him home. But whether or not you take him home or not, that's your decision. But I do want to address the psychology that you believe that you can hold everything together and that under your care that you can guarantee that he's going to make, quote unquote, the right decisions. Ask the next steps about parent involvement. Ask them about length of stay. Be honest about your agendas about length of stay. Ask them how they will make use of wilderness therapy. We don't want to start from square one. You've done some stuff here. Make sure that they talk to the wilderness therapist here. Make sure they reach out, connect to our wilderness therapist. And then in the end, you do the best you can and you turn it over to your child. It's up to them. This is, it's like the story I've told many times where the father was awake at night, not knowing his son during a field visit was giving him a difficult time. And the dad, I stopped the dad from trying to sell the son and I said, just tell him that you don't know. Tell him you're doing the best you can. Tell him you lie awake at night not knowing if you're making the right decision. Be honest about it. And tell him this is your best guess. But you can't be 100% perfectly sure that you know. And just turn it over to the child. Own your decision, don't sell it, and take it one step at a time. Looks like I've gone the full hour. I don't know if there's any questions that have come in. Anyway, it's open. Let's save any questions for our next session. Our next session, which will be, let's do a Q&A next, Malia. How about that? Since we went over for the hour. All right, folks, upcoming announcements. If you want to do a deep dive in your own work, we're doing online intensives, 2.5-day intensives. They're more affordable. The shorter term is you want to make the deep dive and come out. We have a safe protocol. You can ask our program director about that. We're doing in-person Finding Yous also. We also have Finding You 2 in person and online. Go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Like I said, pursuits, adventure trips, think therapy light, think sober fun. Those are options, and they're customized 3 to 30 days. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. Follow us on social media. All of these broadcasts are available on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform. Just search Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to soundcloud.com. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram. On Twitter and Instagram, use the handle @EvokeTherapy, and then our Evoke Therapy Intensives program also has an Instagram account. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. The Evoke Family Foundation is on Facebook, and you can also go to evokefamilyfoundation.org if you want to give back, if you want to offer help. They need new board members. They always need resources and donations. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. The audiobook out soon, any day now. The second book, and I read it myself, so I'm looking forward to releasing that in the coming days. We're going to do, I'm switching up the schedule. Next week, we're going to do a Q&A. I'm going to do that every other time. So next week, on Monday the 31st at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, we're doing a Q&A. So any question left over, any question, you can invite family and friends and siblings to come and attend live if you would like. Feel free to share the link. Happy to take any questions from them or about them when that happens. So I hope this broadcast was okay while I'm here in quarantine in New York. I hope these are helpful point of contact, like I said before. Thank you for on behalf of the work that you're doing for your children, for those that love you and that you love. Take care, folks. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.